Welcome back to the lab at Canvas. This is our third meeting, and if you notice, things are a little bit differently this time. We're not on the stage. We are going to do something a little bit more interactive today. If you recall, in our first meeting, we talked about our own personal beliefs in the image of God, and we also spoke a little bit about the pervasive Western civilization view of God. As the Santa God, if you will. Our second meeting, we dove in a little bit more, and we really kind of discovered that intentionally or not, perhaps we had strayed into a place that was a precarious balance between an iconism, which is no image of God, with a bit of animism, which is God in nature or seeing nature as representative of God, with some personification of images of God. Again, the old male Caucasian image of God. So with these different balances that we left it our last meeting in, what we want to do in this meeting is take what we have learned and kind of put it to the test a little bit within our own space, within our own church, actually. So one of the things that we want to do tonight is expand the lab and really take a look at our home church. And what we want to do collectively is we want to walk through the church. And with your sheet in hand, really want you to just kind of jot down what you see in our space. If you see something that you feel is representative of different parts of that spectrum, just kind of jot down, this thing in this room. And then what we'll do is we'll regroup and we'll share notes on what we've seen. Wow. So we've done a walk around of the building of our church. Just want to open it up. What were your initial thoughts of just that exercise, given what we've been talking about in the last couple of sessions?
Being a derivative of Calvin and him being not very much icons or no icons of God, there weren't too many icons in our area. I mean, we do have our good old Presbyterian symbols. So we have dove, the cross, and the fire within the Presbyterian as well as the church and everything else that comes in with that. And we have it often in our children's book for pictures and images. But I mean, you go into the sanctuary outside the symbol of the cross, there's not many icons.
I don't think it's required that I need to go on the hunt for images of God, because I really don't think about God as somebody or as a being, as a power that is located in one particular spot.
I noticed that in a lot of the song lyrics too, for the 20 most popular songs, they were about either the power or the love of God, but it was all done through Jesus. So it was very much, I guess, that more that personified, but not necessarily but that's Jesus, but that's who, I mean, through the Trinity is part of God, but it's not, I don't think, the full, like, God picture, kind of like how we've been discussing for the last, now 3 sessions.
All of this is obviously by design, right? I mean, we have a lot of cross imagery. I found a lot of cross imagery.
Lots of crosses.
Lots of crosses all over. I mean, and even our cross imagery is not very, like, in your face cross imagery either. If you're looking for it, it's in every room. But if you're not looking for it, you could almost not even see it except for the cross up at the front of the sanctuary, right? The biggest imagery when it comes to like a personified God is Jesus. Jesus you see in all the children's spaces, in all the children's books. And sometimes Jesus is white with blonde hair, and sometimes Jesus is brown with dark hair.
So for me, the 2 biggest things outside of that I thought were really important is there's a lot of books in this building and a lot of song lyrics. And I think that kind of falls into the Presbyterian tradition of we recognize the power of words. Words are symbols, and the words that are around here are very powerful. Right on the stuff where the branding for the church is, thoughtful, creative community. And I think those are 3 great words and symbolic words that represent the image of God. Love, you can find that word in every room in this building. It's just amazing to me. The only place that I really struggled is when you first walk in the door, there's these circles of chairs. It just invites you to be part of a community and talk to your neighbor. And then as soon as you go into that space, there's rows of chairs facing an elevated stage. And I thought, wow, the power dynamic shifts totally. When you're in here, it's community and family and circles and flat. Mm-hmm. And when you go in there, there's definitely a feeling
It's a class system.
A power system, which reflects images of God from a tradition process that we can't escape. But the words that we use to combat that are really powerful. Love, welcome. So it's almost like we're a tension here, fighting against the traditions that were handed down to us and trying to break out of those without tearing down a fence for no good reason.
All the cross images are empty crosses.
Mm-hmm.
There's not.
Oh, yes.
There's not a Jesus on the cross.
No, there's no crucifix on the cross.
Yeah, these are all empty crosses. And again, I've been in many Catholic churches, and many a Catholic church is not an empty cross. Mm-hmm. There is a Jesus on that cross. So.
And the one Madonna and child that we have is very abstract, but there's a cross in that picture as well.
Did you guys find anything that you personally felt like resonated with you as an image of God, as a presence of God for yourself?
It's, for me, not particularly outside of, it's really the feelings that I have for this place. Like, I may be hallucinating, but I think if I remember right, you were alluding to that it's God, it's within the people, it's not necessarily a place or an image, but that God is among us. Mm-hmm. The care that this community has offered, the open invitation, the overall intellectual honesty, the openness to engage. I love this place. I love this community. I love that, I love that I can be away for like a month and then I come back and someone will say, I haven't seen you for a month.
Yeah, I really feel that very strongly here. I think God's love is demonstrated in so many ways. I was looking at all the song lyrics, and it wasn't the song lyrics in particular that made me realize that God was present. It was the worship that we do in there, the actual physical presence of all the people and their worship as a community. And I think that is more powerful image of God than anything else in that room. that, the chairs may be set up artificially, but the worship is authentic.
So one of the things that is kind of interesting, right, is that for our church, we are very subtle, right? Is that an accurate word that we could say?
Yes.
I want to know your thoughts in terms of, do we gain something from this subtleness?
I think the subtleness allows for more expansiveness and for everybody to kind of come with however you have in your mind or in your soul, like what God looks like or what that image of God looks like. It's, you can come and be with that image. It's not this is the image that we as a church say you should have, and so we're going to put it everywhere. So I think the subtleness in that way has that purpose of kind of being welcoming to all the diverse ideas that we have talked about with the image of God, and that has been discussed over history as well.
I think that if you have a lack of imagery, as in the Protestant tradition, it allows for each individual to access his or her concept of the divine. And I think that is one of the points of the Reformation that was made very, very clear, that we are a priesthood of believers, and that you do not need an intermediary in the priest to assure your salvation. And so I think it's a very theological necessity in a Protestant church to have subtlety and to not have images glaring in your face.
To me, what that lack of image does for me is it engages me and forces me, especially with the greeter at the door, into the community. I'm not necessarily going station to station, engaging privately with an icon or an image or anything like that. If I want to try to get something from here, it's not going to be from an image, but it's going to be from the people and the people in the church.
If our image of God is someone with no power, is that okay?
I don't think so. But that's the reason why I don't think so, is because that leaves us, if my God has no power, I am struggling, then, well, I have no one to turn to outside of my own family. Like if you're asking if I need a God that has power, then yes, I do, because if my God has no power, then I don't need that God, and therefore that God doesn't exist.
We're gonna watch this video of Doreen, 9-year-old Syrian refugee. And while you watch this, I want you to consider, whether it's your personal belief or not, I want you to consider, what if the image of God that is out of the bag was not the Western Zeus figure, but was instead her? I would love for you guys to tell me, what was your initial reaction to watching that little documentary piece on Doreen?
She's a little girl who has absolutely nothing in terms of material wealth or power or any kind of authority whatsoever. She's at the mercy of everybody, including her family. And she's really extraordinarily joyful regardless. The image of her doing cartwheels just gives me great delight. Even though she has nothing, she loves her life. She loves her friends, and love is abounding in her family. She picks up her brother with great enthusiasm.
And when you look at her and you think about what we've been studying and this image that has been pervasive, the Zeus father, the all-powerful, the almighty, the all-knowing. And the challenge that I put to you is, what if we put Doreen there instead? And I challenge you guys to walk around and said, how would this building look different? How would you be different, even?
Well, I think this is a very interesting exercise because we've talked about, and I've talked about, how this Western image of God, even though it's not pervasive in Canvas, it's not pervasive necessarily in our church building and in our community, it is so pervasive in our culture that we're not even aware of how it impacts us sometimes, right? So then we take the opposite of this image of an older European man with power, and we replace it with this young girl who has nothing, this refugee. And obviously, a lot of the male language would change. But also, I think it's interesting how even in our nurseries, there are lots of adults at the center of children's attention. And I think that one imagery that would change is children would take more of a center stage. We would value them even more, I think. And we forget, I think, the value that comes from children, the strange wisdom that they bring by the questions they ask, and also play. Play would be really pervasive, I think, more in our culture. I think we as a culture would probably value play a lot more. We saw her with her friends doing her cartwheels, and you know, we talk about how our kids learn through play and how play is vital to their education and vital to their growth, right? But at some point we become adults and we don't play like we used to. And I think that could be a difference that we would see as well.
Well, and for me, I was thinking about how in the documentary, even amongst everything, it was very community oriented. You know, she was out working in the fields with not only other kids her age, but other adults. And then at the end of the day, they all got in the truck and they rode home together and they were back to, you know, the camp together. And, you know, they were kind of like leaning on each other and talking and smiling at each other. And then in her home, it's very much, you know, mom and dad and auntie and, you know, her siblings and cousins are all at the same table. So I wonder if the worship style of how we would worship would be more like how it's in this room, where it's the circles of chairs versus the lines of the rows of chairs. Instead of being orderly, it's more kind of like free flowing.
I am lucky enough that I earn enough money that I can live and survive on my own.
Mm-hmm.
That was not the case for my family when they first came over here. That's not the case for her and her family.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you can't survive on your own, you need other people. And for my family, the only people you can really trust is your family, because your family's your family no matter what happens. Like,
That's interesting, because in America in particular, we are so segmented in the way that we live. There are a lot of people that do have really close-knit communities that really do you can count on in an instant anybody, but there are a lot of people who live disconnected, right? We operate in a society that values independence more than interconnectivity. And you can be independent when you are the man with the power, when you are in charge and you are in a position where you can be independent. But if you're a child, you have to be interconnected. And to think of worshiping a God that values that interconnectivity way, like, more than just as a value, but as a necessity. I mean, we say we do, we know we do, but at the same time, culturally speaking, this is not necessarily our group, but culturally speaking, we live in a culture that really values independence over community and interconnectivity.
So in Doreen's story, she's living with her parents, her aunts, her grandparents were probably in the picture. But in our story, like Amy alluded to, our tradition is totally different now. Independence is what we value. As soon as I can get out of my family's house and start my own thing and become successful and make money at a job, that's what I'm going to do.
But I think that's changing.
I think it is too, and it should, because that's a horrible way to live.
When we looked at Doreen, it did sound like there was something there that we felt a connection to. And I will be upfront that what I heard from you guys was not pity, was not empathy. It was a connection of something. Does somebody want to elaborate on what that might be?
When we look at people who have no power as an image of God, how does that change us as we live our story? And I think sometimes when we look at people, right, the creation narrative tells us that God's image is in all of us, all of his creation. So everybody we look at, whether it is the Zeus person, which we have strong problems with, or Doreen, that image is in both of them. So the question then becomes, how do we live that image faithfully? Because that's based on a story of how we use that power and that nature of rule. And Doreen uses hers faithfully, and her joy is contagious. But when somebody abuses that power, it becomes oppressive, and people don't like that. They want to be liberated from that. There's a great theologian, Native American, Ray Aldred, I think is his name, Cree, Native American, and he told this story once about a project he did where he had a whiteboard and he asked people to describe homeless person. And he was just writing down all the descriptions of people. And when they got done, and he said, if we kind of run the gamut, he said, now look at this board, and do you see anything positive in any of the descriptions that we put on here? And there wasn't anything positive. And he's like, if this is the way we see people, this is the way we treat people. But when we start to use different things, homeless people are resourceful. They're smart. They're survivors. And when we start putting positive labels to people who don't have power, we treat those people completely different. When we think that they can't give us anything, that we can only give it to them, then we hold the power and we build structures that reinforce that power. But when we think we can learn from them much more than we can teach them, then we have to look at our structures, and that's why we see systemic failures everywhere. We, for a long time, have been trying to give power away that we don't really own to people who already have it and don't want the version that we're trying to give to them. And so Doreen's story kind of speaks to that question.
I mean, it seems like what you guys are saying is the image, the essence of God is in all of us. And it is about recognizing that. I know just in general, there is an unfathomability there. But when we get to that part of the spectrum where it's personification, maybe it's not personification from an individual, from an iconic image, but more how do we practice this more widespread ability to see God in all of us.
I like to think of two competing stories, right? So let's just imagine that we live in a world where there's a limited amount of pie. And the goal for all of us is to see who can get the most pie. That creates a structure. That story, even without an image of God, that story creates a structure and a power dynamic where now we're competing with each other to see who can get more of the pie. So that's one version of the story. If you have another story where there's an infinite amount of pie, you'll never ever run out of pie. And you believe that story, it changes how you interact, because now all of a sudden I can get all my full of pie, right? And never, I got so much that I want to give it away, right? And every time I give it away, there's more coming in. It just drives me crazy. So I think the story that God tells us in the creation story is this story. God has all the power. There is no power outside of God. Every power that's been given on heaven and earth comes from him.
Absolutely.
And so we live and worship a God with infinite power. So when we get to the crux of the story, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, and we get to the kenosis passage, we understand that Jesus, though being fully equal with God, gave up that power voluntarily, because he wasn't so concerned about his rights, he was concerned about everybody's rights. He believes in infinite pie. So we live in a world where everybody wants to fight for their rights. But if we took this mind, which was also in Christ Jesus, where instead of saying, hey, I gotta fight for my rights, I started valuing other people as more important than myself, because there's an infinite amount of rights. If somebody's being persecuted, I should stand on that side with the persecuted, because that's who God stands with. I shouldn't try and support the power structures, whether they're ecclesiastical and church powers, or political, or corporate. We shouldn't stand on the side of the people who are oppressing people and saying there is limited pie. We should stand on the side of the people who say, let's give pie to everybody, because we'll never run out of pie.
I think one of the reasons that everybody is so pigeonholed in their thought process and in their idealism and their faith is because there's so much information pouring into us all the time that we can't process it well.
Mm-hmm.
And the church has done a very pathetic job of educating in the beliefs of the church as opposed to the beliefs of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I really love this idea of everybody can have pie. Because I like pie. But
I do too.
I love
With
pie.
ice cream on it.
Yeah. But the idea that God is available to everybody and that we're all created in the image of God and there is some little flicker of the divine in everything and everyone.
Which means we have to do what you said with the exercise of the homeless guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to encounter everybody looking for God, not
Yes.
our enemy,
And
not
God.
who might hurt us or who might take something from us or threaten us or cause us fear, but look at each person and say, okay, God is in you, so let me find.
Our last meeting, we're going to do two things. We're going to do a bit of a creative exercise in terms of free-flowing art and some of that. But then also, we're going to expand the conversation beyond just our church. And I think you guys have started to brush up against that. Is how do we as a culture, how do we as Christians start to do some of the things that you guys are talking about? How do we start to erase the Zeus and start to see our God in all of us? And is that how we can incrementally take a step towards repairing maybe some of the damage that this whole conversation has done over the centuries? That's something for us to explore next time. Thank you, guys.